So let's just wait until all the attendees populate, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good, thank you.
So welcome attendees. As you guys are kind of trickling in, I just want to say I'm super excited to get to not only moderate, but also attend this panel because I was planning on doing it anyway. So like two, I guess, stones, right? I'm forgetting my analogies, right? English second language, no accent, but still. But I really want to thank CrimCon for giving this space for such an important topic. We're going to proceed in the order of the program. Each presenter will generally have a set amount of time, 10 minutes, although this is a roundtable, so it's a little bit different. So I'm going to let them kind of do their thing. Danielle has to skedaddle at the half-hour mark, so we'll try and get her questions answered first, but generally we'll have them send them into the Q&A, not the chat, and we'll monitor that way. And if the panelists want to include their Twitter handles in the chat to all attendees and panelists, please do that so they can follow you for awesome other content and advice, because you guys post amazing things. So let's get started. Danielle.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Danielle Slakov. I am an assistant professor at Sacramento State in criminal justice. I do have to leave at the 30-minute mark because I'm teaching. I promise it's a great reason. I teach class at that time. So my esteemed panelists were nice enough to say that I could go ahead and go first. So very briefly, when I first started thinking about pedagogical tools and self-care, I came to realize that my way of doing this is very much by modeling what self-care looks like. So on the very first day of the semester, I do share with my students the things that I do to maintain work-life balance. So for example, I share with them my hobbies, my interests, the things that I do for physical activity, which changes all the time, but right now it's biking and dancing. So that's what I'll tell them. And then even what I'm like currently watching and reading. And I find that this is important to humanize me, but to also show that, you know, I have these other interests, these things that take up other parts of my life that bring me joy, that are completely outside of my job. I also let them know on the very first day that I am less responsive on the weekends because that is the time I set aside for myself to rest and recharge and spend time with my family. And I tell them that on day one. So I think that that's another way that I sort of model what self-care looks like. So now in a COVID semester, I'm teaching synchronously, and I do a class check-in at least once a week where I have everybody tell me in one word how they're doing. And then I go 3, 2, 1, go, and everybody does it at the same time. I also sprinkle in activities around gratitude, either as extra credit or as participation points throughout the semester. So I think those are just some of the other ways that I kind of bring self-care into the classroom. I was recently in a meeting with an associate dean and told her about my one-word check-in and how I think it's going really well. And I told her that I also participate and that recently I put stressed because that was the one word that I was feeling at that moment. And she said something that really resonated. She said, you know, I think it's important to model what it looks like to be stressed, but to still be there and getting your job done, because we're all going to face that. So that was really nice feedback from my associate dean on that. And so it's obviously informal at this point. We're in this, you know, crazy semester, but I did ask for feedback on the midterm about how the semester is going. And I got a lot of feedback about gratitude for discussing self-care, about discussing gratitude in the classroom. And a lot of students said it was helpful to see how other people were doing and to have that kind of classroom culture going. I also had students tell me that they feel like they can talk to me about what's going on in their lives because we do have that culture in the classroom. And so I think as an educator, that's absolutely priceless to have that relationship. So I'll leave it there. I just want to thank my two esteemed panelists and colleagues for letting me go first, since I do have to leave, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Danielle. So I guess I can jump in next. I'm Danielle Rousseau, and I'm at Boston University and teaching there in the Department of Applied Social Sciences. I teach in criminal justice, but with a mental health focus. And my background is actually in clinical forensic psychology. So I practiced as a therapist before kind of shifting gears and coming into academia and teaching and doing research. So I bring that piece really into the classroom with me and really stress self-care and radical self-care in my work with my students. And, you know, so many of our students are on the front line. They are first responders. They're, you know, working in law enforcement, corrections, mental health. So I really have a lot of discussion of self-care, what that means, what radical self-care is, and really this idea that radical self-care is the notion that how we spend our time matters. And in that, I talk about the importance of the daily disciplines that we engage in to meet our basic needs and to promote well-being and promote resilience, and how these daily habits are really easy to do, small things easy to do, but also really easy not to do. So self-care is not selfish or indulgent or this extreme thing, but it's actually fundamental. And it's what sustains us in doing this work of change. And ultimately, we cannot give what we do not have. So I talk about this in all of my classes. And it really started in the mental health classes because I teach forensic behavior analysis. I teach courses in trauma and crisis intervention and sexual violence. So I was really starting to stress the importance of self-care and self-compassion in those courses. But then I realized it was important everywhere. So I really started to integrate it into all my classes and talk about the importance of all the, you know, really basic things that we do every day. You know, the importance of hydrating and nourishing our bodies and moving, getting outside, thinking, making sure we take time to rest, connecting with others, you know, doing the practices that sustain us. And in my classes, I have self-care forums. So students can post what they do for self-care. And it, you know, it can be any type of self-care. And it has been a great source of sharing and connecting. And students have been very open to it. They share their practices, you know, a whole diverse array of practices. And they've also been sharing resources as well. So especially now in the current time, they've been sharing links to, you know, online yoga or online workouts that they like, or different resources that are accessible to everyone else in the class so they can seek out those resources as well. And of course, like you said, Danielle, modeling is a big piece of it as well. So I talk a lot about what I do for self-care and what's important to me. And I talk about how hard it is that, you know, these things are simple things, but also sometimes super hard to do. And I'm just very real about that to help, you know, support them. And as in talking about self-care, I also talk a lot about self-compassion. So the idea of having kindness towards ourselves and having grace for ourselves when we mess up, when we fail, when we don't live up to the standard we set for ourselves. And also the idea that that's normal, that's part of the human experience, and we all mess up. So I share a lot about that, and also integrate mindfulness and practices like that into the work, gratitude as well. And, you know, those have been really powerful, and students are very responsive as well. I think they appreciate the recognition that, you know, there is stress, and particularly now, and that there are things we can do to help support ourselves and each other through that. And, you know, it's been very empowering and powerful and supportive. And I've also done check-ins, particularly this semester, just very informal, like, how's everyone doing? And, you know, I think everyone is really appreciative of that as well.
Are you all set? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Danielle's. I was saying to before everybody got here that I'm the Sarah, so I'm always like the third or the fourth. So it's nice have my moment in the spotlight on the panel. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Sociology at a private university in New Jersey called Rider University. And before I became an academic, I actually was a social worker. I got my MSW at BU, Danielle R. And so I'm kind of steeped a little bit more so than the average bear academic in what self-care is, what it looks like, and sort of normalization of those kinds of discussions. So that has always kind of been a feature of my teaching. But I noticed a couple years ago, a lot of, and this is the pre-COVID landscape, but a lot of faculty development stuff started to shift to this grit and growth mindset kind of vibe. And while I think that there is a lot to be said for some of the messaging that you were saying, Danielle S., right, that it's okay to show up and know that maybe today is not going to be your best day because you're stressed, and holding space for stress is important. But I started, my little social worker self started feeling a little like, about like how much, especially grit, was being really, really privileged among other ways of responding to and interacting with students in educational spaces, particularly in thinking that this idea that if you just work hard enough, that we're kind of leaning into this bootstrapping mythology that really, further disadvantages people that come from traditionally oppressed backgrounds, A, and B, kind of compromises what I think is a really important element in any classroom, and that's joyfulness, that's fun, that's play. And of course, COVID has really made the enterprise of joy seeking and fun seeking a little bit more challenging and required a lot more innovation. But I would say that the silver lining of COVID has been that it has beautifully reinforced some of my better instincts in the classroom, some of my better senses about what students in or outside of a pandemic need from us, because we are in part educators, but we are also in part facilitators of this collective community. And so as a social worker, I'm very much invested in what that looks like and how we can create that space while also, paying attention to explicit curriculum that we need. So, I mean, I think that there were concerns before COVID hit about the fact that, this problematic mythology around grit is not ideal, because while we want students to show up and try, we also don't want to institute this narrative that is just rife with falsehoods and with this Americana mythology that is just, I find, unfair and also not very productive. And then when you look at just the anxiety that a lot of college students faced even prior to COVID, I just felt really uncomfortable with how much that kind of like just real intense commitment to grit as like the main way that you come to a classroom and attempt to engage with students was only going to institute and instill more anxiety, because a lot of the anxiety that college students face is in fact performative. And so to then say, well, you just have to push through, you just have to persevere, because ultimately like we demonstrate and evaluate your worth according solely sort of to your outputs, and whatever is going on in the background, whatever is going on in the way that you understand yourself as a holistic being, it just doesn't really matter, because you just need to show up. And not only do you need to show up, you need to put in your best every day and kind of block out all the noise. And so I have always kind of welcomed the noise into my classroom spaces. I think it's been really helpful to do that. And I think one of the beautiful things about COVID, as challenging as it is and has been, and I have a 3-year-old, so I've been doing this all with a toddler, so it has been very challenging, but is that it has kind of taken the veil away from the ways that students have often struggled in silence. And I think that while there is a magic about being able to come together in a classroom and have your 90 minutes and then have the 90 minutes gone and then the students disperse throughout the hallways and you have no idea what's happening with them and for them, but this idea that now we've kind of invited ourselves all into everyone's inner circle in a way, I think has been really illuminating and really powerful, and a real lesson for me as an educator that I think I will keep with me a lot. And I think for me, the ultimate thing is that as though I hold myself to a rigorous standard, though I want my students to get a lot out of my explicit curricular goals, I also want students to understand fundamentally that they can show up just as they are, just being who they are. and that is okay. And modeling is an incredibly important way to do that, to indicate and show that underneath the veneer of the fancy professor, who they always assume makes way more than we actually do, right? There is a human being, right, that is struggling at times, and at other times distracted by joyfulness in other arenas of their lives. And so that's been really, really important to me. And I think on top of the wonderful things that the Danielles have already said, I have memorialized some of the expectation setting that Danielle S. talked about in my syllabus. So I have a paragraph about being a working parent and being a partner and having a life that exists outside of the classroom, and not being available unless there's an emergency for weekend emailing or for late night responses about a question on a paper. That I'm here and I show up and I give my all when I'm in the classroom, and I have to feed and take care of other pieces of me outside of that time as well. And that's really important. So expectation setting from the beginning is important. And I found that using like this, we talk a lot about modality with respect to pedagogy content-wise, but I think various modalities with these kinds of check-ins are also really, really helpful. So I have used Jamboard quite a bit, allowing students to just pick, and I'm now like dating myself, is it a GIF, is it a GIF, GIF, whatever, a meme thing, and just throw it on the Jamboard, and then their little avatar goes away and it's anonymous. And, you know, how are you doing today? Or what is this week about for you today? Or what are your victories that we want to celebrate this week? And so providing both anonymous and non-anonymous and verbal and non-verbal opportunities for feedback, and thinking very intentionally about speaking to different kinds of human beings, not just different kinds of learners. And I think we do that a lot in our teaching, right? We pay attention to, oh, well, do we want to have a 1-minute reflection paper? Do we want to do a think, pair, share and break people up into talking? And I don't think the discussion around self-care and how we engage self-care in the classroom has been that broad and that nuanced. And I think that it's really important to do that. The other thing I'll say is just, you know, I think I have traditionally before COVID been good about integrating self-care in my class sessions in particular, right? So making time to check in with folks, touching base with them and seeing how they're doing. Having them check in with one another, being very open about reach out to me if for some reason you can't make a deadline, just be in touch with me in advance. And in thinking about what radical self-care means as a professor, I have really landed in a pretty critical place around traditional assessments and grading. And that is something that has really come through this last 8 or 9 months. So, you know, when we're in this kind of universally challenging environment, it's easy to see when students are stressed, what are the particular vehicles for that stress in an educational setting. And while obviously deadlines are important in professional spaces, I've really worked with my students around how do we communicate in a professional and humane way what we need. Because the reality is, like, outside of college, we blow deadlines all the time, right? It's not about that. It's about being able to have a rapport with the people that you're working with and being able to express what you need and why you need it, or what you're unable to do and why. And that's really hard. And giving yourself permission to do that is really hard. But I have kind of approached my teaching and my grading from a very different lens now that COVID is here. And really, I used to be one of those people that was like, oh, I don't mind. I won't take off 5 points if you just email me before. But if you haven't emailed me before, then I'm going to take off 5 points for every 24-hour period. And I was trying to institute humane grading policies, but have really pulled the dial back even more and said, like, all right, well, how about instead of having like an assessment, we have many more reflective assignments where you're just getting points for completion. And I just want you to bring yourself to the table and honestly engage critically in some of the stuff that we're thinking about. And I have newly added in a lot of sort of process-based reflective sections, even in more traditional assessments. So, you know, for instance, I had some of my students in a cannabis class I'm teaching do a resource audit to see how many BIPOC authors they could find writing about cannabis. Spoiler alert, there's not many, right? But then to have them talk about what it was like completing that assignment in the week that they had to do it given what else is going on in their lives, and sort of if there was anything they wanted to share with me about them as human beings. And that was a piece of the assignment. And so I've really tried to be more intentional about that kind of stuff. And while we haven't done full evaluations, I did do a midterm check-in that was more formalized in terms of it being a survey. And students, just the gratitude for showing up and showing them day after day that they can come to this experience as they are, and that is sufficient and that's enough, is an exact counterpoint, I think, in many ways to the grit mindset, and has been so deeply appreciated by my students. So in any ways that we can continue to do that, particularly, you know, as we continue to fight the throes of this pandemic, and then even after it, I think students learn better, they have more fun, they care more about coming to the classroom, they feel more connected to each other, to their learning process, and to you as a faculty, and that ultimately just makes for a much more meaningful, and in my case, gratifying educational experience. So that's why I wanted to share.
Thank you all for that. That's so many amazing strategies and tips, and just in general, an amazing approach, right? Especially given current circumstances. So I want to give Danielle S. an opportunity to answer some questions, just because she has to skedaddle in a few minutes to go teach a class.
Yes.
So, I mean, I know, terrible, awful reason. You're so unprofessional. So I know there's one directed at you. How do you do check-ins one-on-one or in group, in writing or in person? If you could just speak a little bit to that, and then if you want to address any of the other questions.
Sure. So I do that classroom check-in where everybody at the same time pushes enter on the chat and gives me the one word of how they're doing. But I also, in every email that I send, I say, how are you all doing? Let me know if there's anything I can help with. So I try to institute it in my normal conversations with them. And then I also, to Shelly's question, and thank you for the love, Shelly, to all of the panelists, I do include assignments that have opportunities to talk about the things that are bringing joy to your life. So just in the last week, I asked people to share with the class in a discussion board one thing that's made them smile recently. And I said, just keep it classroom appropriate, right? And people were sharing pictures of their siblings in the cutest Halloween costumes I've ever seen, and things like that. And it was really, for me, actually really re-energizing to see what brought people joy even in this really hard time. So that was something that I'm like, I should have done this one sooner. What is something that made you smile recently? Because I feel like I learned so much about them, but also got to see a new window into their lives. In person, I actually started every week with, can 3 people tell me something great that's happened since the last time I saw you? And I was worried, I'll be very honest, I was worried that potentially class-based, like for example, people that have more money would say things like, you know, I was able to go on this trip this weekend, and I didn't want anyone to feel like that wasn't a possibility for them. But students were the things they shared were awesome. Things like, oh, I got a job, or I set a boundary for myself that I've been struggling with. So usually, even though it did take up class time, I'll be honest, but I think that even though it took up that class time, it was really important to share with each other those types of things. And then I did want to say, since I do have to leave, Nora asked a question about professors being understanding with students who are struggling. And then specifically, many professors will only work with students who have suffered great injuries or lost a loved one. You know, that for me personally, that hurts my heart to hear that. I've heard that from other students, absolutely. For me, there doesn't have to be any qualification on it. If somebody shares with me that they need time, or that something's going on, then that's all that I need. I will share, and many of you are people that I follow on Twitter and engage with. Many of you know that my dad was really sick during my undergrad, my master's, and passed away during my PhD program. So I tell my students that on day one, that I get it, that the first time I ever went to an office hours was to tell a professor that I didn't think I could get the final paper in on time because I was struggling. And so I tell them that story right off the bat. And I tell them it doesn't have to be this intense, but I do understand, and I am here for you. So I think part of what all of us just touched on is honesty with them about ourselves and about our own experiences. and also recognizing that we all have things going on. Right now with COVID, I have many students who have been exposed to COVID, have come down with COVID, and I really, no questions asked. If somebody needs extra time, I just give it to them. I know that might not be popular for some professors, but for me, that's what it comes down to. I even have class presentations this semester, and I have a backup day in case something happens and people aren't able to make their day. I have a backup day scheduled. So those are just some of the things that I'm doing to try to foresee that potentially this is not a normal semester, but also we shouldn't be acting like it is either. So sorry to take up all that time, but just wanted to give a response to those questions before I have to jet.
Thank you for that, and appreciate you making the time to come here, even though you were kind of double booked. So thank you. If one of the other panelists wants to share, I don't know who wants to go first to respond to some of those questions.
Yeah, I'll just go. Sorry, Danielle.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of what Danielle said. And I think, just sharing what your life is like outside the classroom from jump is really helpful. And so there's ways, like I said, that I try to kind of formalize that. I push against this idea that you should be completely divorced from your personal life in the classroom. I found it to be an incredible bridge between students. I, like Danielle, lost my father 2 weeks after defending my prospectus after he was sick for a long time, and 2 weeks after giving birth to my kids. So I was in the throes of trying to navigate a lot of really intense deadlines during that time. And, really remember thinking that it would have been so much easier to share, like with my advisor, for instance, like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to make this chapter deadline. Like, this is what I've got going on. If there were a more just diffuse level of transparency among my mentorship. And so I've just really led with that from the beginning of my teaching career, and have just found it to be really powerful. And so I have changed my syllabus even from last semester. I mean, I took out that 5 points thing. I've never been like a huge attendance roll call person, because again, things happen. Sometimes we as human beings miss meetings. And I've always tried to emphasize in my syllabi, for instance, like, please just reach out to me if you're able to let me know that you can't come. But I just completely took away all these sort of like punitive, even though they felt like sort of kinder punitive ways of grading, I just took out all of those policies in my syllabi. And the example I gave you about the resource audit assignment is very typical now of the kinds of assignments that I do, where I have students remark on something that is explicit curriculum, like we were talking about the racialization of marijuana prohibition, and then do something to seek out information about it, and then reflect on that experience, not just as somebody that completed an assignment in a sterilized way, but reflect on what the process was like completing that assignment in the in the context of whatever their week had before them. And so I found that has been a really powerful tool for students, because they feel like they're able to provide context for themselves, not as a way to excuse what output they've provided to me, but just because ultimately at the end of the day, we're all human beings navigating this life together. And I found it to be a really powerful way to disrupt some of these very traditional top-down ways of thinking about education that actually make for not super great classroom environments. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And there are unfortunately so many like very rigid, hard lines in academia that it's just not trauma informed. It's not trauma informed practice at all. And, hearing discussions among academics of, how do we force students to turn on their videos during online sessions? And I mean, I never want to do that. I would never do that, because there are so many reasons that somebody might not want to, might not be able to, might not have the technology to turn on their camera, or maybe they're taking care of children or family members, or who knows what. It doesn't matter. If you're showing up, I'm so grateful that you're there. And if you can't, something comes up and you want to listen to the recording, that's great too. I want students to be able to engage in the way that works for them and to get the most out of the course. and sometimes we, at least in my classes, we address really difficult topics. So I want students to be able to feel the flexibility to do that in whatever way works best for them, and to step away if they need to, or to turn off the camera if they need to. And, there's no penalty for that, or, no strategy for penalizing them or tricking them or forcing them to do anything. Because again, that is not at all trauma informed. And, I'm just open about that. And, to Nora's question, absolutely, we need to be flexible always, but particularly now. And that should never be based on, some note from a doctor or some major life event. If you need to take time, if you need extra time on a project or an assignment, no problem, just let me know, and we'll make it work. We'll get through this semester and we'll figure it out and get the most value out of it, but also get through it. And so I think we need more flexibility. We need more grace and understanding in academia. And obviously, I'm speaking to the choir here, but I think we need to be models for that, not just to our students, but to other faculty. So, I try to talk about these things in department meetings and faculty meetings. And sometimes it's like, oh, I've never thought of that, or I've never heard of that. So kind of just being the self-care warriors out there, modeling it in academia, I think is really valuable too. And to Shelley's question, I do try to integrate it, directly into the coursework too. And in many courses, I have like contribution points that can be earned different ways. And so there'll be like, we use Blackboard. So Blackboard discussion forums where they can write about their self-care. I had a Blackboard discussion forum where everyone was sharing pictures of their pets, their cats and their dogs and different animals. And so that was, really positive and stress reducing. So I definitely try to integrate it both informally and formally, where they can earn points for it. And also, as everyone talked about so far, in multiple modalities. So written, anonymous, not anonymous, like live discussions, chats in the chat box, kind of having different ways so that everyone feels comfortable engaging in these practices in a way that works for them.
I love all those points that you just shared, Danielle. And I would also add on the sort of faculty lens piece of this, that I have found honestly that some of the biggest barriers to implementing successful self-care approaches in my pedagogy are how vastly different those strategies are from sort of the standard course in much of academia. For instance, I spend a lot of time trying to have my students unlearn that sharing, they don't have to disclose what it is, but sharing that they have a need, sharing that they need flexibility on an assignment is not in fact a sign of weakness or being a poor student. It's a sign of being like a really consummate professional and just a solid human being. And I think that I spend a lot of my time counter messaging what I view as ultimately pretty toxic and non-productive messages that students come to college with through their experiences in high school. And then oftentimes, unfortunately, those messages just only get further entrenched as they continue in college. And so like when I've had students that, I'm posting on my announcements on Canvas, I'm talking about it in my live sessions, I'm writing people emails saying, it's totally cool. If you need to take another week, go for it. Just give me a heads up so that I know, so that I know not to reach out to you and bug you if you got stuff going on. And I can't tell you the number of times that I hear, I've just never done this before. And last time I reached out to my other professor 2 days ago with the same set of circumstances, they just said, absolutely no, you're getting a 0. And so we have to understand that we collectively disincentivize behaviors that are absolutely necessary for productive and healthy student bodies in the very ways that academia tends to operate by default. And yeah, I hear you, Frank, that you hear that. I hear that all the time. And so I do think that as much effort as we spend really in the trenches with our students, working one-on-one with them, there is an effort. And again, like I said, when I came into, when I was on my job market search and all this stuff, I mean, just the language around perseverance and grit and Americana just really asserting itself through suffering and silence, never expressing or sharing vulnerability. I mean, just kind of like classic toxic masculinity vibes throughout, right? We stay strong. We do not reveal when we need something. And that's been a great impediment to me in trying to help my students. And so the other message that I would give is that exactly what Danielle just said, it requires being an ambassador outside of your classrooms as well, being an ambassador amongst faculty and staff as well, because I think that is sorely needed as well.
Thank you for that. So that actually segues really well into Frank's next question. So he has two parts. So the first is, how do we get our male faculty and male students to be more aware of the need for self-care and to open up? And then the second part is, how can we better help students to be willing to share issues and ask for help? Having an inner city population of working adults, I often have students with serious issues. I'm a very flexible person, but I often have students who just disappear and sometimes reappear weeks later behind in the course. So if one of you wants to address either or both of those pieces, I definitely think that first part definitely segues really well with what you just said, Sarah.
Yeah, I really agree with what Sarah said about being an ambassador. I think that is how we do that and how we get everyone on board. You know, when people hear it and hear it and hear it, you know, it becomes less of a foreign thing. And having the different opportunities for sharing self-care in my courses, I think has really been helpful in getting all students involved. So men as well, particularly with the discussion post of share your self-care, they are very into that. And, you know, a lot of times it starts with, you know, physical workouts and things like that, but, you know, very engaging, and people open up. And I think it feels like a place that they can do that. And particularly when seeing everyone else post. And so they all start sharing links of different, you know, resources that are available. So I think that has been really helpful, where it's not like on the spot, you're in class, like, okay, and you tell me your self-care strategy, which again, is not a very trauma-informed way to do that, but just having it sitting there kind of for the semester. There's no deadline for it. You just, when you want, you go in and you write up your strategy and share tools that you have. So it kind of normalizes it and everyone gets on board. So I see that as a really, it has been an effective way of doing that. And, you know, I think just again, modeling that flexibility and having conversations around, okay, what can we do together? How can I support you in what you need to make this work? You know, and that goes to the example of, you know, if a student disappears and then comes back, just being flexible to work on different levels and saying, okay, can we make a strategy to maybe set some minor deadlines or set a roadmap for you to do what you need to do to get through the semester and to get to where you need to go. So kind of working as a team and being on board and going to where that student is with them, like going to their side and saying, okay, how can we move forward? What do you need? How can I support you? And it's a very different approach, I find. And a lot of students are kind of hesitant at first. They say, really? You mean I can't take extra time? Or you're not giving me penalty points for not handing this in today? No, I take the time you need. Absolutely. Take care of yourself. Self-care is most important. Take care of you. And then we'll figure out, and you know, no penalty, like we'll just figure this out and you'll get through the semester. And you know, you'll get to where you need to be and you'll get something out of this course. When you don't have that flexibility, I feel like it adds to the stress and, you know, the uncertainty and all of the triggers of stress, and elevates the student's stress level so that when they're trying to get the assignments or whatever it is done, they're not getting as much out of it and not getting as much out of the course. So if we can work with them, that's a way to help them empower themselves, but also get more out of the coursework, whatever that is.
Yeah, I think those are really, really good questions. They're hard questions, but important ones too. And I think, one way to appeal to faculty and to kind of get people on board is I have never given somebody more time with extensive flexibility and had a worse paper or a worse assignment that I would have gotten if I had pushed them after leaving their night shift. And so it truly does make your experience as an educator more fulfilling. It makes grading easier because you are not necessarily getting everything in an onslaught. You are sort of getting things that trickle in, and the quality of stuff that you get when you exercise that degree of flexibility is just better, because exactly like Danielle was saying, students actually can take a moment and say, all right, well, this is when I'm in the headspace to do this, and dive into the material and not feel this sense of being epically crushed by this, let's just call it what it is, an artificially imposed deadline. And I think that, explaining to students that there are certainly situations in life and work where deadlines matter. Like if you want to get married, you gotta get your marriage certificate before you do your ceremony, unless you don't want to be legally married, in which case the deadline doesn't matter, right? If you want a grant, you want grant for startup money for research, you have to get that done in time. But the vast majority of stuff that even we do, and I think this is important because I think they often see us as these sort of deity-like creatures that are just sitting there perfectly timing deadlines and never missing one at all corners of our life. I mean, that's mythology. It's not true. And even the faculty that impose strict and rigid deadlines on their students often blow deadlines because I work with them. So, it's about kind of normalizing this idea of, the human experience as imprinting itself on the professional experience, and really trying to get that point across as effectively as possible with faculty that are resistant. One way to do that is that it truly does lessen the cognitive burden of processing and assessing those evaluations. It just does, because they're more pleasant to read because they haven't been made under duress. It's the way it works. So I think that's one thing. I think in terms of the piece about maleness in society, I think that's a real thing. But I have found that doing what Danielle suggests, so for instance, I'll create a poll everywhere that's anonymous, and I'll just leave it up for an entire week and just say, go in and drop anything off. I use Jamboards and other sort of collaborative documents where people can just add to them at any point. I don't take access away. It's not something that's on a whiteboard in Zoom and then it disappears after 12 minutes of an activity. And I found that has really helped sort of class level participation in these kinds of activities. And I do think, peppering in anonymous opportunities for people to share and not be called in or called out for being emotional or having a rough time. I've found that when you do that enough and people see oh, I'm not the only one suffering, and there is an acceptance and a love here that we have for one another in this transient community collective that we have over the semester, it really does bring people out of their shell. And I've found that regardless of gender, people tend to be pretty warm and open once that rapport is established. But I think where the mistakes come in is that it doesn't become a part of your pedagogical practice. It's when you just randomly decide oh my God, everybody seems like they're freaking out and I have not established this rapport and it's week 7 and I'm just going to try this. But if you institute this stuff from the beginning, from jump, and it becomes part of what students expect you to do and expect their peers to participate in, it is really powerful how it kind of makes those, pieces of student identity that you would think might be hindrances to having these sort of mushier, gushier conversations, it really helps them fall away. So my advice would be start early, be consistent, and provide diverse opportunities for participation that are not constrained to one modality or one discrete time period.
So the next question is for Danielle. So it's Professor Rousseau spoke about opening a dialogue with colleagues at Boston University about incorporating self-care aspects in their teachings. I was wondering if panelists have other strategies to encourage faculty members to incorporate self-care in their curriculum.
Well, I will start by saying I think overall, both in the classroom and with other faculty, we need to normalize that we're human beings and we need to normalize stress. We need to normalize mental health issues, that it's normal to be dealing with mental health issues, physical issues, all of these things, and normalize the fact that every single person is a multifaceted person. You are not only a student or only a professor. We have families and childcare responsibilities, health issues, mental health issues, a diverse variety of things that make us who we are. And I think we need to normalize that and not try to, silo the different pieces of our identity and put up these barriers and pretend that, we are this, one aspect, and that's all we can talk about or reveal. I think that when that happens, that's really problematic.
Yeah, and I would just add that I consider this a really powerful and important equity issue that cuts across lots of different intersectional aspects of identity. And so just as I consider it my responsibility, like as a white woman, when I hear something in a group setting that does not feel appropriate from a perspective of being anti-racist, like it's my responsibility to say something. And I have not absolved myself of that same responsibility when I hear in meetings or at times when faculty veer into a student blaming kind of perspective. I consider myself somebody that is comfortable being an agitator and a disruptor of that status quo. So I can give you an example of the ways that this sort of, grit mentality infiltrates academia. So we at our institution have both hybrid classes. We have a very limited number of in-person classes, and then we have a lot of remote classes. And what some of my students have been telling me is I was on Zoom and I had 2 students literally Zoom in from the car while they were driving. And I was like, oh my gosh, my mama senses, like, turn off your freaking computer, drive safely. If you can join us, great. If not, it's recorded, like it's okay. And so what I found out was that there were a lot of students that had hybrid classes that were meeting in person, and then they were not living on campus because we don't have the space. And so they were trying to rush home to then log onto their computers to get to my class, which is like this whole brand, again, like we're stripping away like all of these, layers of cloistered struggle, and it's now coming out. And so, there was this discussion in some kind of faculty space of like, well, that should be completely inappropriate. My students, if their cameras are not on the beginning of class, they get points off. And then this retort of like, well, we have these spaces on campus where people can stay, right? And to which I said, that is making many assumptions, right, about the health status, not only of our students, the economic status of our students, the relative privilege of our students, and assuming that they don't have additional roles that extend beyond their role as a student. And perhaps they cannot stay on campus because they don't feel safe, or they live with a high-risk individual, or maybe they have to go to work, and so they're going to Zoom in from their break room before they start their shift. And to not acknowledge and hold space for these kinds of issues is a way that we are putting the brakes on doing what many faculty say that they want, which is to advance equitable education practices. And so it's really about calling in people in a way that helps to move them along to understand, if you express a desire to have your students do well and to care for the circumstances of your students and to have them succeed, then we have to demonstrate that in all corners of our ways that we discuss and implement procedures that influence their educational experience. And that's just what has to happen. So that's my advice. There's ways to do it that I think are professional and still say, well, have you considered X? And in my case, what I can tell you, and Danielle, you can speak to this in a minute, but having so many modes of communication open with my students is such a gift, because I find that often with faculty, like if we have a shared student, I won't disclose the student, but I'll be like, we have a shared student and I can tell you that they're experiencing X or Y, and that's really impeding their ability to come to your class on time or whatever. And so just having that rapport with students is really helpful and powerful, because then you can say, I'm not just like hypothetically saying this is an equity issue, like I know this person's story and they're struggling. And that goes a long way, I think. That's my
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think we have to be advocates for change and doing the self-care work necessary ourselves to sustain that, because absolutely yes to everything you're saying, but it's also not easy. It's not always easy, particularly when things are coming from administration or, areas where, maybe it's risky for a faculty to speak up. It's really challenging. So I think keeping the priorities of understanding, like, no, we should all be here for equity in education and for helping to create an environment where students can be their best and get what they need and want out of the program without feeling, that it's adding stress to their lives and is, a problem. We should be building resilience and setting them up, particularly in criminology and for students who are going to be working in the field. We want resilient people doing this work. We want people who have these self-care practices so that they go into the field, they can be sustained change makers and work towards equity, work against racism, all of these things that we stand for. But if they don't have that foundation, that's where we see problems, in the field and in practice. So we can really change the entire, I believe, this is my opinion, but I believe we can change the entire criminal justice system by changing these approaches and by really forefronting self-care and forefronting resilience building and trauma-informed practices as well. So teaching, no matter what the course is, teaching about trauma-informed practices, what that means and what that looks like in practice in the field. And I think these are the ways that we can see transformation in the criminal justice field.
Thank you guys for that.
Yeah,
that's
just continuing to, okay, we're gonna have a workshop on grit. Well, let's also have a workshop on trauma-informed teaching practices, because one thing that I hear back a lot is that in being flexible, we are actually hindering resilience. That's something that it's a refrain that I hear quite a bit from some faculty that say, well, no, like students just have to learn, and if we coddle them or hold their hands throughout this entire experience, then they'll never learn. And so I do think, Danielle, you're completely accurate that this, especially as a newer sort of person trying to do it, it is a lot of work, because you are basically making at times like, individual educational plans, right? With like all of your students, and it's a lot to keep track of and it's a lot of work. But I think there's a big gap in what faculty, particularly faculty that have been around for a while, because I think trauma-informed care is something that is becoming more discussed, but they're not aware that actually resiliency is not built through these really rigid protocols. Resiliency is built in the ways that we're talking about. And so if we can make that connection and say there's really an evidence base here, there's a reason that we do this beyond just trying to be kind, I think that kind of programming is really needed in higher ed too.
I agree. So we're coming to an end where I have to close this out so it saves, because we're butting up against 2 o'clock. I just wanted to summarize 2 key things that you guys said each, right? You brought up grit and resilience, and you brought up more of this professionalization and kind of professionalizing people to not only understand what self-care is for themselves, but potentially also to then have more empathy for those who are just as involved, right? I think one of that speaks to, if you guys know the Marshmallow Test, right? We later found out it's about class, and you spoke about equity. And so they don't always know that they can get extensions. So you have to let them know, right? Those who email us, sometimes we're like, oh, okay, we'll just give it. But those who don't know to ask are the ones that probably need it the most. And you guys, because I follow you guys on Twitter, right? You've been sharing these pieces, and I personally have learned from you guys. So like I incorporated freebie late submissions into my syllabus. You get 3 for the whole semester. Each module or whatever assignment can be submitted within 7 days. I don't care if it's because you just wanted to play hooky and go to the beach and you needed the day or whatever else. That way you don't have to ask. And then I say, if there's anything else, just email me for extenuating circumstances, right? So like your guys' discussions of that and understanding what grit is and that equality and equity, I think is really, really important. I really want to thank you guys for modeling that behavior for folks who are going to watch this later, not just now, right? So thank you for that.
Absolutely. And this has been such a wonderful conference experience and a really just wonderful discussion. So I've loved these questions, and just, thinking about how we can continue to innovate and serve the people that we're here to serve, who are students, and take care of ourselves as well, so that we don't burn out. Because there's just a piece, I don't know if it was Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, but the levels of chronic stress that faculty are facing too. And so when you create space for stress and the human experience to come into the classroom, you also create space for yourself to be seen as a human. And I think that more than ever, faculty need that. And so it really is a mutually reinforcing practice in your classrooms.
Terrific.
Thank you all for showing up for this
It's been a
discussion.
delight. I threw up my Twitter handle in the chat box, and it was really lovely to have this discussion. And I wish you all well, and take good care, right?
Yes, please do. And if you scroll all the way to the top, I wrote everyone's Twitter handles if you want to copy those. So please contact them. I'm sure they're going to post amazing things. So follow them for all of the wonderful insights and tips and strategies that they have. And I hope you guys have a great remainder of CrimCon.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Be well.
Bye.
Bye.